Number 1.
Francesca Santana was brimming with happiness on the afternoon of October 21, 1985. She had arrived at Brookdale Hospital in Brooklyn, New York 3 days earlier to give birth to her third child. It had seemed to be a routine delivery to Francesca, but her newborn daughter, Marlene, had developed a severe case of jaundice shortly after birth. Doctors were concerned enough about the baby's bilirubin levels that they decided to keep her hospitalized for a few extra days. Marlene's levels had stabilized sooner than her doctor had expected, and Francesca had just received the welcome news that she and her baby would be discharged from the hospital later that afternoon. Francesca had just finished feeding Marlene and was leaving the nursery to go back to her own room when she paused at the nursery window. She stood there for a few minutes, admiring her daughter as she slept peacefully. When she turned away from the window, she saw that she wasn't Marlene's only admirer. There was another woman who was also looking through the window at all the babies. She smiled at Francesca and asked her which baby was hers. Francesca proudly pointed out Marlene, and the woman commented that she was certainly a beautiful baby, and she appeared to be quiet as well. She congratulated Francesca on the birth and then made her way down the hallway. Francesca went back to her hospital room and didn't give the woman another thought. By the time Marlene was given a clean bill of health and all the discharge paperwork was completed, it was dark outside. Francesca's cousin and her sister-in-law came to the hospital to take Francesca and Marlene home. They helped Francesca gather her belongings and reminded her not to forget the pink gift bag the hospital had given her, filled with various baby product samples and diapers. Confident they weren't leaving anything behind, the three women headed for the elevator and then walked through the hospital lobby and out the front doors. Francesca made sure that Marlene was snugly wrapped in her swaddling blanket and hugged her close. The weather was still mild, but she didn't want to risk having the newborn catch a cold. The women chatted excitedly as they made their way to the street corner, where they stood and waited for the traffic light to change, so they could cross over to the parking lot. Francesca told the women that she couldn't wait to introduce her 5-year-old daughter and 3-year-old son to their baby sister. While they were still waiting for the traffic light to change, Francesca spotted a familiar face walking towards them. It was the woman she had seen standing at the nursery window, and it appeared she had just left the hospital as well. The woman said something as she drew closer to Francesca, but the new mother couldn't make out what she said. Assuming the woman was complimenting Marlene, Francesca simply smiled at her. The woman, however, had a much more sinister motive for approaching Francesca. As she got next to her, she pulled out a black handgun and pointed it at baby Marlene's head. She told the women to stay quiet and follow her. If they didn't obey her directions, she would shoot the baby in the head. With the gun firmly pressed against the helpless infant, the woman shepherded the three women away from the hospital. Francesca felt as if everything was moving in slow motion. Her instinct was to grab Marlene and run, but she was terrified that the woman would go through with her threat and shoot her baby. All three of the Santana women immediately complied with the woman's command to keep walking, praying silently for someone to see what was happening and come to their rescue. The woman forced them to continue walking for 6 blocks, ignoring the fact that Francesca, who was still recovering from giving birth, was in obvious pain. Finally, she told them to stop near a deserted junkyard. Except for an occasional car that drove by, there were no other people in the area. Keeping the gun pressed against Marlene's head, the woman scanned the street and appeared to be debating her next move. Then, in one fluid motion, she yanked the infant out of her mother's arms and stepped into the street just as a white car was driving past. The woman waved at the car, then quickly climbed into the backseat with Marlene and slammed the door. The car immediately pulled away, and Francesca never saw Marlene again. At first, the women were unable to move, completely stunned by what had just happened to them. Reality quickly set in, and they ran screaming up the street towards Brookdale Hospital. Employees there tried to console the women while they waited for the police to arrive, but it was clear they were becoming hysterical. The officers who responded had a hard time getting any information from the women, but they tried to describe what had happened as best they could in between sobs. Francesca mentioned that she thought she had seen the woman earlier in the day, but she didn't know her name and had never seen her before their brief encounter at the nursery window. Francesca was from the Dominican Republic, where her husband, Juan, had been the owner of a successful car wash. They wanted a better life for their children and had come to the United States before the birth of their first daughter in 1980. They didn't know many people in the area, they mainly socialized with the many members of their extended family who lived in the area. The entire family was devastated by the abduction of Marlene, and it made them question how safe they really were in America. Wanting to do everything possible to get her baby back, Francesca forced herself to stay calm so she could give police a good description of the kidnapper. She had been a whiter Hispanic woman, 24 to 30 years of age, and relatively short, perhaps 5 feet 2 inches tall. Her hair had been a reddish blonde color that appeared to be dyed, and Francesca thought it might have been a wig. Francesca worked with a sketch artist to come up with a composite sketch of the woman, and it was distributed all across New York City. Marlene's abductor had gotten into a white Chevrolet Malibu, most likely a 1976 model, and the women recalled that it had red lettering on its side, but none of the women could recall what it said. Police believed it was most likely one of the many gypsy cabs that operated in the city. Because they were unlicensed, they were nearly impossible to trace. Police believed it was possible that the driver of the unlicensed cab had no idea that he had been the getaway driver for a kidnapper. The women recalled seeing the abductor scanning the street before she finally snatched Marlene, so it seemed plausible that she had simply hailed the first cab she saw. At a press conference, they pleaded with this driver to come forward, as he was likely the only person who could tell them where the abductor had taken Marlene that night. Unfortunately, despite a massive publicity campaign, no one ever came forward claiming to be the driver in question. Police went to the store where Marlene's swaddling garment had been purchased, and they bought a duplicate so they could show the public what it looked like. Made of thick cotton with a zipper running up the front, it had a pastel pink and blue print with little white rabbits on it. Police asked for people to keep an eye out for this distinctive pattern. The woman had also taken the pink gift bag of samples that Francesca had been given at the hospital. When she was abducted, Marlene still had a plastic hospital identification bracelet fastened around her ankle. Police admitted that this likely wouldn't assist in finding her, because they were certain the abductor would have disposed of it right away. Still, they believed there was a chance that Marlene had been abducted by a mentally ill woman who wanted a child of her own, so they asked the public to be on the lookout for any friends or neighbors who hadn't appeared to be pregnant, but suddenly announced that they had given birth to a baby girl. The day after Marlene was abducted, there was a horrifying discovery made in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. Someone had dumped a newborn baby girl in a dumpster. She was found by someone picking through the trash. At first, it was feared that the baby was Marlene, but a footprint check proved that it was not. Police believed that someone had given birth to the infant at home and immediately disposed of her in the dumpster. The mother of the infant was never identified. During the first few days of the investigation, police were kept busy following up on tips of possible sightings of Marlene. They checked out each lead, questioning dozens of new mothers seen with infants, but each woman they interviewed was able to provide proof that they had in fact given birth to the baby in their possession. Oddly enough, a 2-month-old baby boy was abducted from another New York City hospital the same week that Marlene was kidnapped. Police looked into the possibility that the cases were connected, but determined they were not. The baby boy was recovered safely a few days later, and his abductor was arrested and able to prove she had nothing to do with the abduction of Marlene. The timing of the two abductions was purely coincidental. There were rumors of an underground adoption ring operating in New York City, and some people believed that Marlene had been kidnapped and sold in an illegal adoption. Detectives did look into this, but they believed that the woman who took Marlene was not a professional criminal. They feel that the woman was likely someone who either lost a baby or was unable to get pregnant, and she took Marlene to raise as her own. A month after Marlene was abducted, police admitted the tips had slowed and they had not made any real progress on the case. At a press conference, Francesca made an emotional appeal for the public to help her find her baby, insisting that she needed to be at home with her mother. She and her husband also announced that they were offering a $20,000 reward for the safe return of their daughter. The family had thousands of flyers printed up to announce the reward, and they distributed them all over the city. They were hopeful that the money would entice someone to come forward with the information police needed to solve the case. Another month went by, and it appeared that all leads had been exhausted. Police were no longer trying to find a newborn, but a 2-month-old baby, and their search was complicated by the fact that they had no pictures of Marlene as an infant, and no way of knowing how much she had grown over the past 2 months. Still, they continued to appeal to the public for help, and local newspapers repeatedly printed the composite sketch of the kidnapper. The Santana family was completely heartbroken at the thought of having to spend their Christmas without knowing where their daughter was, so they announced that they were increasing the reward for her safe return. They had new flyers printed up to advertise the $25,000 reward, and the New York police announced that there was also a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Marlene's abductor. Despite the hefty rewards, police received no new leads. By the end of the year, it was clear that the case was going cold. Although Marlene's devastated family did what they could to keep the case in the public eye, it eventually fell from the headlines. Police continued to follow up on any tips that were called in, but admitted that it had been weeks since they had any solid leads. Another push to solve the case was made around the one-year anniversary of the crime, but no new leads were called into police. On the second anniversary, a composite sketch showing what Marlene might look like as a 2-year-old was released. Police made new flyers that included this sketch, as well as the sketch of Marlene's abductor, and they were distributed all around the city. A few new tips came in, but unfortunately none of them led detectives any closer to finding the missing Marlene. Francesca and her family never felt completely safe in New York after Marlene was abducted, and they eventually made the decision to move back to the Dominican Republic. The couple would eventually have 2 more children, but never stopped hoping that they would one day be reunited with Marlene. Police have never forgotten about the tiny infant who was abducted at gunpoint, and though they do believe that Marlene is still alive, they think the only way the case will ever be solved is if someone with knowledge about what happened finally decides to come forward. If you have any information about Marlene, please call the New York City Police Department at 646-610-6914.
Number 2.
She should have called off from work that afternoon. That was the main thought on Michele Reidenbach's mind while she was at her part-time job on September 22, 1981. She hadn't felt great when she got up that rainy morning around 6:30 a.m., but she was scheduled to have her senior portraits done after school that day, so she made herself get up and get dressed. She skipped breakfast and was ready and waiting when one of her friends picked her up at 7:45 a.m. for the short drive to Seneca Valley High School. Her mother, Gloria, was getting ready to go to work, and the two left their Harmony, Pennsylvania home at the same time. The day was fairly uneventful. Michele, known as Shelly to her friends, finished classes around 3 p.m. and had her senior pictures taken. She then left for her job at Mel Denn's appliance store in Zelienople, Pennsylvania. Shelly's friend, Kim Charlier, also worked at Mel Denn's. The job mostly entailed writing advertisements and addressing envelopes, and the two girls would chat while they worked. On that day, however, Kim had called out of work as she was feeling sick. Shelly called her while she was working to check up on her, and they spoke for a few minutes before Shelly said she wasn't feeling any better herself and was going to walk over to a nearby pharmacy to pick up some cold medicine. It was about 4:30 p.m. when Shelly left Mel Denn's. She left her purse, school books, and cigarettes inside, and she didn't put away any of the files she had been working on. The pharmacy was close by and she didn't intend to be gone long. She cut across the parking lot of the super-duper grocery next door and spoke briefly to her older brother, Vince, who worked at the grocery store and was in the parking lot. The pharmacy was only a short walk from there. Shelly went inside and purchased some cold medicine, then left for the short walk back to Mel Denn's. Around 4:55 p.m., Gloria stopped by the appliance store. One of her older daughters, Cheryl, had suffered a massive stroke 3 months before that had left her partially paralyzed, and Gloria was heading to the hospital to visit her. Shelly had been devastated when her sister had become ill, and she spent as much time as she could with Cheryl. The previous weekend, Cheryl had been allowed to take her first outside excursion since her stroke. She was permitted to go to a nearby store, and Shelly had insisted on being the one who got to push her sister's wheelchair around. Knowing how much she loved seeing her older sister, Gloria decided to stop and see if Shelly wanted to go to the hospital with her. When she discovered that Shelly had left work to run an errand, she decided not to wait and made the drive to the hospital alone. Normally, Shelly would get a ride home from work with her brother when he finished his shift at the grocery store. Vince waited in the parking lot for a few minutes that evening, but Shelly never showed up. Vince knew that she hadn't been feeling well, so he assumed that she had decided to leave work early and had gotten a ride from someone else. When Gloria returned home from the hospital that evening, she was surprised to find that Shelly wasn't there. At first she thought that perhaps her daughter had stayed at work late to finish a project, and she expected her to call asking for a ride home. By 11 p.m., there had been no call, and she started to get a little worried. Shelly rarely stayed out late, and she would always call and let her mother know if her plans changed. Gloria began calling around to some of her daughter's friends, but none of them had heard from her. She forced herself to stay calm. Shelley was a responsible teenager with a nurturing attitude and was probably helping out a friend who had gotten into some kind of trouble. Gloria was sure that Shelley would show up soon and would have a good explanation for where she had been. When she still hadn't heard from Shelley the next morning, her mother called the police and reported her missing. Although the police did respond quickly and began an initial investigation into Shelley's disappearance, the news media wouldn't pick up on the story until the following week. Because she was a teenager, law enforcement initially believed they were probably dealing with a runaway. Their main concern at that point was the weather. Temperatures had been mild during the day, but the weather report was predicting the first frost of the season that night. If Shelley was out there somewhere without shelter, they needed to find her quickly to minimize the risk of exposure. As police began their investigation, they quickly determined that Shelley was not the kind of teenager who would have run away from home. Shelley was the youngest of 7 siblings and was extremely close with her family. She had no known problems at home or at school and had even written several essays about the love she had for her family. None of her friends believed there was any chance that she would have decided to just walk away from her life without telling anyone. Her best friend, Beth Staub, had seen Shelley right before she went to work and was adamant that everything had seemed normal. Shelley had already gotten her senior picture taken, but Beth wasn't having hers done until later in the afternoon. Shelley went into the ladies' room with Beth to help her primp for her picture. When they finished with her hair and makeup, Shelley lent Beth her hairbrush and a necklace she was wearing, telling Beth to just return them once her pictures were finished. Unfortunately, Beth never got the chance. By the time she was done having her picture taken, Shelley was already missing. Beth stopped by Mel Dens later that evening to return Shelley's items, but was told that Shelley wasn't there. According to Beth, the owner of Mel Dens told her that Shelley had received a phone call and left soon after that. He wasn't sure who the phone call was from, but it was likely Kim Charlier, her ill coworker. Beth headed for her part-time job at a nearby gas station, taking Shelley's brush and necklace with her. She figured she would just give them back to her at school the next day. She didn't realize anything was wrong until Shelley's boyfriend showed up at the gas station later that night. He said he and Shelley had plans to meet up when she was done work, but he had been unable to find her. He thought perhaps Shelley had forgotten about the date and had gone out with friends instead, and he stopped by to ask Beth if she knew what was going on. Kim had spoken to Shelley around 4:30 p.m. the previous day, and she knew Shelley hadn't been feeling well and was going to take a quick break to go get some cold medicine. If Kim herself hadn't been sick, she would have been at work that day with Shelley. The two girls spent hours together while they were working, and there were no secrets between the two of them. She described Shelley as being incredibly responsible and in constant contact with her family. Kim's birthday had been the weekend before Shelley disappeared, and the two had spent the day together at Kim's house. Later in the day, they decided that they wanted to go to the movies and then out to eat. Shelley tried to call her house to let someone know about her change in plans, but hadn't been able to get a hold of anyone. Before they went to the movies, the two girls drove back to Shelley's house in Harmony, just so she could leave her mother a note detailing where she would be. Kim told detectives there was absolutely no way Shelley ever would have even considered running away from home, and the detectives agreed. Investigators didn't believe that Shelley had run away from home, but they had no idea what could have happened to her. They fanned out across the town, interviewing anyone who had any kind of contact with Shelley in the days prior to her disappearance. After interviewing a pharmacy employee, they were able to confirm that Shelley had been in the pharmacy a little after 4:30 p.m. and had purchased some cold medicine. The clerk hadn't noticed anything unusual, and Shelley had been alone while she was in the store. She left as soon as she paid for the medicine, and at that point her trail went cold. The area she had gone missing from was considered the business district of Zelienapol. Although it was a small town, there were still plenty of people around at the time that Shelley disappeared. Several witnesses came forward to say that they had seen the teenager at some point, but there was no way to confirm if the sighting had been before or after she had visited the pharmacy. Fred Landy, one of the owners of Mel Dens, said that he had seen Shelley standing in the parking lot of the Super Duper grocery store and assumed she was on break. She appeared to be by herself but was talking to someone who was sitting in a red car. This is believed to have been immediately before she went to the pharmacy. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time and was unable to give a description of the person. When Shelley didn't return to work, he assumed that she had gotten sicker and had left early. It wasn't until later that he found out she had left all her belongings in Mel Den's. She had also left files out all over her workspace, which he said was not like her, as she always put things away when she was done with them, and normally kept her workspace very neat. Police were able to track down the person they believed was the driver of the red car. He was questioned by detectives, but they determined he did not have anything to do with Shelley's disappearance. Shelley's disappearance baffled investigators. Everyone they spoke with described Shelley as being friendly, responsible, and family-oriented. They could find nothing to indicate that she had any kind of problem that could have induced her to run away. She disappeared without taking any of her belongings with her. She left her purse and cigarettes at Mel Den's when she ran to the pharmacy, taking only enough money with her to buy some cold medicine. Both her family and friends told investigators that Shelley was a chain smoker who never would have left her cigarettes behind if she was going to be gone for more than a couple of minutes. Although she had a cold, she had still been seen smoking earlier in the day. There was nothing missing from Shelley's home, either. She had no extra clothing with her, and $100 in cash, money she had been saving to buy her class ring, was still in her bedroom. Shelley had no problems in her personal life. She had a steady boyfriend, and their relationship was stable and without any issues. He was interviewed by police, and voluntarily took a lie detector test regarding Shelley's disappearance. He passed the test easily, and was never considered a suspect in the case. She was a good student and had no problems at school. She was excited that it was her senior year, and she and her friend Kim had already made plans to take secretarial classes at the Bradford School after graduation. The only upsetting event in her life had been Cherry's stroke, but this certainly wouldn't have been a reason for her to run away. She had always been close with her older sister and was determined to do everything she could to help her recover. There was nothing that would have made her run off while her sister was still in the hospital. By the following week, detectives were certain that Shelley had been abducted. She simply didn't fit the profile of a runaway teenager. At this point, the local media picked up on the story. The coverage helped bring in some leads to police, and they investigated each one, but none brought them any closer to finding Shelley. Somehow, on the short walk from the pharmacy to the appliance store, she had simply vanished. For police, the logical conclusion was that she had gotten into a car, most likely with someone that she knew. She was a fairly streetwise teenager, and her friends and family did not believe that she would have accepted a ride with anyone she didn't know. If someone had tried to force her into a car, she would have put up a fight, and there were enough people in the immediate area that it's unlikely an abduction could have taken place without attracting attention. Police pursued every lead they received, but had no luck figuring out what had happened to Shelley. They conducted countless interviews and had several people take lie detector tests, but no one was able to provide any information related to the disappearance. The case quickly went cold. In 1989, Gloria contacted producers of the television show Unsolved Mysteries to see if they would air something about Shelley's disappearance. The person she spoke with said that there was a waiting list of people trying to get coverage on the show, but suggested that getting petitions signed would increase the chances that they would cover the story. Gloria immediately began circulating petitions in stores in Harmony, Cranberry, Evans City, Butler Township, and Butler City. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to get her story on the show. In 1993, investigators announced that they were taking another look at Shelley's disappearance after someone called claiming to have information about the case. They re-interviewed a number of people and were hopeful that they would be able to move forward with the investigation, but unfortunately nothing came of it. The case is technically still open, but there have been no new leads in years. Gloria never gave up hoping that one day she would see her daughter again, but she died in November of 1999, without ever learning what had happened to her youngest child. Her brothers and sisters still think of her often, as do her friends from school. They are not optimistic about the case ever being solved, but concentrate on keeping Shelley's memory alive. It's been nearly 40 years since Shelley disappeared, and all of the detectives who originally investigated the case are now retired. Shelley's case has been passed down to new detectives many times, and some of the officers now on the force weren't even alive when she went missing in 1981. Despite this, her case file is still reviewed periodically, and detectives are ready if any new leads come in. They've examined several theories over the years, but have never been able to determine just what happened to Shelley. One thing they all agree on is that Shelley did not run away from home. They believe she was abducted and most likely killed, though they still hold out hope that she may one day be discovered alive. The case is particularly perplexing because it doesn't seem possible for someone to completely vanish from a crowded business district without anyone noticing anything. This makes it highly unlikely that Shelley was abducted by a stranger. Detectives determined it was more likely that she was abducted by someone she knew, but even that would be puzzling. The pharmacy wasn't far from the appliance store, and it was quicker to simply walk across the parking lots that separated the businesses than to accept a ride from someone. It's possible that Shelley was tricked into getting into a car. If someone she knew told her that there had been a family emergency of some kind, perhaps her sister getting sicker, Shelley probably would have gotten into their car. But even if that were the case, she most likely would have asked them to stop by the appliance store so she could get her purse and cigarettes, and a refusal to do so may have made her aware of the fact that something was wrong. The pharmacy clerk confirmed that Shelley had gone into the store alone, bought some cold medicine, and left. Yet there are no witnesses that recall seeing her at all after she had been to the pharmacy. It's possible, though highly unlikely, that she ran into someone in the pharmacy who ended up hurting her. Like most businesses, the pharmacy had a back door that was only used by employees, but someone familiar with the store layout could have forced Shelley out that way. There would have been little chance of anyone seeing a struggle that took place behind the store. Though this scenario is technically possible, it seems implausible. It wouldn't have been something that could have been planned out ahead of time, as no one knew that Shelley was going to go to the pharmacy that day. The idea of some kind of predator lurking in the pharmacy until a suitable victim came along seems far-fetched. Some people have suggested that Shelley did make it back to her job that afternoon, and that whatever happened to her occurred while she was at work. In some ways, the evidence does support this theory. Shelley's friends all agreed that she wouldn't have walked to the drugstore without her cigarettes. She was a chain smoker who never missed an opportunity to have a cigarette. Her cigarettes, along with her purse and schoolbooks, were found at her workstation. If something happened to her after she got back to work, this could explain why her cigarettes were there. There was no sign of the cold medicine she had bought, though. There was also no indication of any kind of struggle at the appliance store, and there were other employees there that afternoon who would have noticed if anything like that had taken place. There are a few people who believe that Shelley did make it back to work that afternoon, and that one of her bosses was responsible for her disappearance. The owners of the store were cited in 1985 for false advertising practices after it was determined that they advertised items as being on sale, but still sold them at full price. There were whispers among some people that Shelley had stumbled upon evidence of illegal business practices and one of the owners killed her to keep her quiet. There is no evidence at all to back this claim up. The claims of false advertising didn't come about until Shelley had already been missing for 4 years. It wasn't a serious crime. The only repercussion was that the owners were ordered to pay a $3,500 fine. Shelley had only been working at Melden's for a short period of time when she disappeared, and she wasn't privy to any inside business dealings. Even if she had managed to stumble upon information pointing to some kind of illegal activity, it doesn't seem likely that the owners would have felt the need to kill her to prevent people from finding out. If anything, the fact that Shelley disappeared while she was working brought even more scrutiny to the company, something that the owners probably knew would happen. Kim had been working at the company longer than Shelley had, however, and held the same position. Both of them would have had access to the same information, and Kim never saw anything pointing to fraudulent business practices. The truth about what happened to Shelley that afternoon may never be known. She is still classified as a missing person, and will remain so until either her body is recovered or she turns up alive. The case is cold but still open, and detectives remain hopeful that someday someone will come forward with the information they need to provide Shelley's family and friends with answers. If you have any information about Michele, please contact the Zelienapol Police Department at 412 452 6320.
Number 3.
Cheryl was last seen in Secane, Pennsylvania on July 12, 1977. She was last seen walking to a friend's house, but she never arrived and was never seen or heard from again. Investigators believe that Cheryl was abducted by a non-family member. After she vanished, investigators got and received tips that Cheryl had been murdered by members of a motorcycle gang and then dumped in the Tinicum Marsh. A few other girls disappeared between the ages 15 and 19 and were later found murdered. Their bodies were found in the marsh after they vanished. All of them had a connection to a biker gang. Investigators have also considered due to time factors that the various murders of these young women might have had some connection to the 1975 disappearance of Wendy Eaton. Eaton vanished in media and has never been found. Investigators are unsure. While Cheryl didn't have a connection to any biker gang, she dated 25-year-old David Thompson at the time she disappeared and might have been going to meet him that night. He was not a member of any biker gang, but in 1978 he was convicted of assault in connection to the fatal beating of a Warlocks motorcycle club. He was sentenced to 23 months in prison for the crime. He has since been released, but his whereabouts remain unknown. Cheryl's friend was also a long-time associate of the Pagans. The Pagans were at once believed to have been responsible for the Florida 1974 disappearance of Amy Billig. No connection has been made between the Pagans or Cheryl and Amy. At the time of her disappearance, Cheryl was rebellious and ran away several times before she disappeared, but always called home to assure her family that she was okay. She never contacted her family again after her 1977 disappearance. Her disappearance remains unsolved and foul play is suspected. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Ridley Township Police Department 610-532-4000.
Number 4.
Gregg Allen Haskell, age 19, vanished from Stuart, Florida on April 21, 1985. Gregg was last seen walking near the Little General convenience store on East Ocean Boulevard at about 8 a.m. He lived in an apartment with roommates on Astorwood Place after moving to Stuart from Wisconsin following graduation from high school. He was working as a construction laborer. Newspapers state that on April 30th, over a week after the last confirmed sighting of him, Gregg had called his parents and wanted to return to Wisconsin. The Charlie Project adds that he seemed unhappy. His parents sent him $100 in cash for a bus ticket, but there is no evidence that he purchased one. His belongings, including a non-functioning motorcycle and clothing, were left behind at his residence. It's not known whether smaller items, like his wallet, were left behind as well. There is very little media coverage of Gregg's disappearance, and what little there is recent. Several Florida papers ran slightly different versions of the same narrative in 2015, when Gregg's case was reopened, and a DNA sample was requested from his family. The articles don't mention him being seen walking on April 21st, but do state that his parents spoke to him on April 30th. There are so many missing pieces, though. If he communicated with his parents on April 30th and was supposed to be living in an apartment with roommates and working, how did nobody see him since April 21? Perhaps the wrong dates were published by the media. I found a press release in the NamUs file, which indicates that he was reported missing on April 30th after he never showed up in Wisconsin and several attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. With contradictions on the dates, I'm not sure if the sighting on East Ocean Boulevard was before or after his parents spoke to him. There's also no indication of when his roommates and employer saw him last, therefore no way of knowing if he ever received the envelope from his parents. I know nothing about his roommates, but my first thought was that perhaps one of them found and pocketed the cash, leading to an altercation of some sort. The Little General store no longer exists in Stuart, but East Ocean Boulevard was about 3.5 miles from his residence. It's certainly a doable walk, but unless his job was in that area, it seems unlikely to me that he'd be there, with no vehicle, at 8 a.m., or that someone would notice and recognize him. Then there are questions that nobody may know the answers to. Why was he unhappy in Florida? Had something specific happened, or was he just generally discontent? The fact that his case was recently reopened suggests it had been closed, even though he was never found. Although Gregg's brother traveled to Florida to search for him, it doesn't sound as though his disappearance was taken very seriously by police at the time. It's unfortunate, as answers would have been easier to obtain when his roommate still lived in the apartment, his boss would have had his work records on hand, and the Little General store was still there. I am hopeful that someone who knew him down in Florida, a co-worker, a roommate, or even a girlfriend will see this and provide some information that could help his family bring him home.
Number 5.
Andre Rand was born as Frank Russian, but his murderous lifestyle has left him immortalized as Cropsey. The name isn't particularly relevant though, it's the man behind it that matters, and that man is genuinely terrifying. Born on March 11, 1944 in Manhattan, New York, Rand is considered to be the most notorious criminal Staten Island has ever known. This designation is largely due to the horrid nature of his criminality, one that involved innocent children. The story of Andre Rand fortunately concluded with a permanent prison sentence, but the convicted kidnapper and suspected child serial killer managed to leave enough tragedy behind that this tale isn't particularly heartening at all. He is currently serving consecutive 25 years to life sentences. The man's dark and perversely engrossing life began as a real-world bedtime story, as the kids of Staten Island were regaled with spooky tales of a boogeyman-esque figure who had a hook for a hand. The shape would drag children away from the safety of their homes and carry them to an abandoned hospital. This villainous entity became known as Cropsey, which Andre Rand soon embodied, as he committed strikingly similar acts as he terrorized the Staten Island community. Andre Rand, the Cropsey of Staten Island, though eerie bedtime stories are a standard, thrilling part of most everyone's early childhood, these ominous little tales soon became disquietingly real. Fact and fiction began to fold in on each other, as local children began to disappear, and bodies began to pile up. Rand worked as a custodian at Staten Island's Willowbrook State School in the 1960s. This was an institution for children with disabilities, funded by New York State. It was operational and smoothly run, or so it seemed, until officials observed questionable conditions and unorthodox medical practices. When it closed, Rand had to find another job. Unfortunately, he spent his time on more nefarious activities. Between the school's closing and the early 1970s, several young girls in the area went missing. The first was 5-year-old Alice Pereira. The initial shock occurred on July 10, 1972. The toddler seemed to vanish into thin air while playing in her neighborhood, just a few miles southeast of Willowbrook. By this point, Rand had already served 10 months in prison for the abduction of several children. He was never convicted of kidnapping or abduction, as none of the kids were harmed, but he did serve time for unlawful imprisonment. Pereira went missing, while Rand was released as a free man. Naturally, authorities considered him a prime suspect in her disappearance. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him, however, and the little girl was never seen again. On July 15, 1981, 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes went missing. Her parents filed a missing persons report, while several witnesses claimed to have seen the girl with Rand shortly before her disappearance. Once again, no actual evidence led to no actual arrest. 2 years later, Rand became the primary suspect once again, when 11-year-old Tyus Jackson disappeared. In 1984, 21-year-old Hank Gaforio vanished. These unnerving incidents left a town in terror, all the more so because nobody was apprehended and pointed out as the cause of these events. Only 3 years later did the police finally catch a break on the investigation. Jennifer Schweiger, a 12-year-old girl born with Down syndrome, was reported missing on July 9, 1987. The search for her, or her body, lasted 35 days and ended in trauma. According to the New York Times, Schweiger was found dead in a shallow grave on the former property of the Willowbrook State School. "When we dug it up and found a little foot there," said Bob Devine, a volunteer on the search committee for Schweiger. "It's something that's going to stick with you the rest of your life." Rand had already been arrested in connection with Schweiger's kidnapping before the girl's corpse was discovered. He was caught lying to reporters, claiming he had never met the girl, which contradicted the statements by numerous witnesses and changed his entire story once his defense lawyer heard about these individual accounts. When Schweiger's body was found, Rand was charged with her murder, in addition to kidnapping. While the jury couldn't come to a verdict on the murder charge, they did convict him of first-degree kidnapping. It was 1988. According to the New York Daily News, although there wasn't enough evidence at the time, Rand was found guilty of Hughes' kidnapping in 2004, over 2 decades after she went missing. Since there is no statute of limitations in New York for first-degree kidnapping, it was possible to charge and convict Rand of the crime. He was given an additional 25 years to life sentence on top of the one he was already serving. All in all, the Staten Island boogeyman sits behind bars to this day for the kidnappings of Holly Ann Hughes and Jennifer Schweiger, and won't be eligible for parole until 2037. Provided he lives that long, he'll be 93 years old. According to Staten Island Live, Rand sent numerous letters to the Advance while behind bars. These were neatly written Mother's Day letters, and directed at all the ladies on Staten Island who supported prosecutorial vindictivenesses against an innocent person. Should I become a millionaire, it would be my true nature to grant all of you with each an envelope full of seeds, to plant and cultivate a rosebush, shrub, that produces roses every season, as a token of my heartfelt forgiveness, year after year, rather than bouquets of rosebuds which blossoms and shortly dies out. His latest writings came nearly a decade after his last correspondence with the paper. In November 2001, he sent them a batch of mail, some of which dated back to 1994. These were just as precisely written, and drafted so neatly, that it seemed a ruler had lent him a hand. The letters included thorough arguments against the nuclear arms race, nostalgic memories of racing hot rods as a child, and emotional pleas to develop a kind correspondence with an old man for friendship. He also included a sketch of a small airplane, and the interior control panel. André Rand's disturbing life was vividly explored in Joshua Zeman and Barbara Brancaccio's 2009 documentary Cropsey. According to PopSugar, the film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival that year and won the Grand Jury Prize for its engrossing narrative and deft production. The filmmaker's approach here was to posit to an audience whether or not this local urban legend had any actual, warranted ties to the life of André Rand. For some of the people who experienced those years on Staten Island and were involved in finding these missing children, a boogeyman figure didn't even come close to portraying Rand's macabre psyche. "I call him the Hannibal Lecter of Staten Island," said Donna Cutugno, the president of Friends of Jennifer for Missing Children, a volunteer group that still searches Willowbrook's 385 acres twice a year in search of the other missing girls. "He terrified a whole community. He still haunts us." In the end, André Rand has been caught and imprisoned. He won't be seeing the world anytime soon, nor walking amongst civilians in the great outdoors, let alone children. Nonetheless, what he did in his early years has left behind massive psychological trauma, young lives robbed of their futures, and an urgency of recovering more bodies. Fortunately, his life can once again be relegated to boogeyman status for those who are capable of doing so, since he'll never be a threat to the community again.
Number 6.
The day marks 47 years since the disappearance of Laurie Partidge from Spokane, Washington on December 4, 1974. If you know me personally, you know I'm a volunteer advocate for missing people and their families, and you likely know my aunt's story. My mother, Kimberly, comes from a family of 6 kids. She is the 4th Partidge kid. The oldest being her sister Laurie Partidge. Her birth name was actually Laura, but everyone knows her as Laurie, a name she chose to go by. Not many people know this about her. I never got to meet my Aunt Laurie, as my mom was 10 years old when her sister went missing. Growing up, my mother would talk to my brothers and I about Laurie's abduction. It was very difficult back then for mom to talk about, and it still is today. She still can't talk about her without crying. It is difficult for all the surviving family members to talk about. My granny died in 2004, never finding out what happened or getting answers for what happened to her beloved oldest daughter. My grandpa is alive at 91 years old. He has waited all these years for answers, with hope to someday find justice for his daughter, holding the perpetrator accountable providing they are still alive, and give his daughter a proper burial. It's what we all want. Some people have asked us how we can say we know she is deceased without knowing for sure. She has never been found, nor her body or bones, no confessions, no trace. How can we say that? We have no other choice but to believe that. Laurie would not have run away. Her family knows this, and it's unlikely that she has been held captive for over 40 years. Until her remains are found and/or someone comes forward, Laurie's remaining living family lives in a painful, unknowing emotional limbo. Another thing we have been told is we should just put this behind us. She has been missing this long. Why can't we just forget about her and let it be? Some people just won't understand what it's like to have a missing loved one unless they are in your shoes, and it's a pain you would not want to wish on anyone. Also, some people are just plain insensitive. Most family of the missing cannot just move on. Laurie personally was a caring person. She would never have stopped looking if it was another family member who went missing. She is valuable. We cannot give up hope that someday justice will prevail. Being an advocate, I have heard of these type of things being said to other families as well. My friend Robin, whose mother Claudia Leslie Wells is also missing, I work with her, along with a team of volunteers at Missing and Homeless, has been told maybe she doesn't want to be found. It infuriates her. Laurie Lynn Partidge was born May 31, 1957, in Santa Monica, California. She would be 61 years old. She was only 17 when she went missing. My mom's family moved from Fountain Valley, California to Spokane, Washington in 1974. Laurie was a member of the drill team and wrote for the school newspaper. She had many friends and a 20-year-old fiancé. They had plans to live on his family's farm, care for animals and have many children. They both loved children. Laurie loved Jesus and enjoyed singing and playing her guitar. She was known to play and sing for her younger siblings and neighborhood kids. My mom has Laurie's songbook that Laurie had put together with her favorite songs she loved to play. As a child, I remember looking through Laurie's songbook and imagining what she was like. Laurie and her fiancé were very excited about their engagement and planned on picking out engagement rings on December 5th, but she went missing December 4th. Laurie left Jolie Ferris High School about 12:30 p.m. She had cramps and wanted to leave early. She called both her mom and dad, who were each working and could not leave. They told her to stay and wait for the bus. With no one available to give her a ride, she decided to walk the 2+ miles home in the 5400 block of S. Custer Road, thinking it might ease her cramps. Laurie was reported missing after she failed to show up at home or for work that night at Lincoln Heights Theater. She was last seen by a neighbor walking south on Havana Street between 43rd and 49th Avenues. The police initially and wrongly classified her disappearance as a runaway, even though her family insisted she would never run away. After she was reported missing, Laurie's father and second oldest child walked the route she would have walked to get home. They knocked on every neighbor's door and spoke to anyone along the route that answered their door or who they came across. They were able to build a timeline where Laurie was and the approx time she disappeared based on accounts of people who saw her walking by. Laurie's dad had purchased 2 tickets to the Beach Boys concert for her. The concert was scheduled for December 9, 1974, at the Spokane Coliseum. These tickets were in her purse at the time of her abduction. Laurie's family begged for permission to check the ticket numbers of people coming in. Her mom had the numbers written down. Police refused to let them, as they said it would hold up people getting into the concert. However, police did show up and looked around for Laurie. Later it was discovered that the tickets were used because they were general seating and all tickets came in, but authorities were unable to determine who used them. It was the biggest lead they had. Police and family also spoke to a witness who came forward in 1974. A teenage girl that was riding her horse around 4:15 p.m. and spotted a man in his 40s to 50s in a field holding a rifle standing with a girl who she thought looked like Laurie, and she described the clothes as to what Laurie wore. They were standing in front of a vehicle described as a white truck with a van back end and a darker colored door. When the witness looked back, the girl was no longer visible. This sighting was near the route Laurie last walked. When the witness arrived home, she told her mom what she saw. Later that night they saw Laurie's story on the local news and contacted police. Nothing came of it. Police also received reports about a green Ford Pinto station wagon in the area possibly following Laurie, and days later someone also contacted police and made a report that they believed they spotted the missing 17-year-old being held captive in the back of a Pinto. These leads never went anywhere either. There were a couple other tips that Laurie's dad and fiancé followed up on, including them driving to Idaho. Again, nothing viable was found. Laurie was very much loved by her family, and when she was abducted, it tore her family apart. Family DNA has been submitted by multiple family members to build a genetic profile in hope of identifying her if her remains are found. Several potential suspects were questioned by detectives, including serial killers Ted Bundy and Stanley Bernson. Hundreds of interviews and polygraphs were conducted, all were determined unsubstantiated. Bundy was determined to be in Utah at the time of her disappearance from his credit card receipts. Stanley Bernson was a traveling Purdue salesman who lived in Spokane and had a route close to where Laurie was abducted. My mom requested several times over the years to have detectives question him again, as he is still in prison for the abduction and murders of young women and suspected of killing several more. In July of this year, 2018, the detective on Laurie's case drove out to Walla Walla, where Bernson is incarcerated, and questioned him again. He denied having any involvement in her disappearance. Her ex-boyfriend and fiancé were also extensively questioned. Her fiancé was never considered a suspect. Laurie had a brown mole on her right cheek. The clothing she was described as wearing was a long, navy blue coat with a hood, a tan V-neck sweater and burgundy tan plaid pants. Her shoes were faded blue Oxford denim with a crepe sole. She carried a brown leather purse with a blue flower design and a braided shoulder strap. There is information on the internet and elsewhere stating that the contents of Laurie's purse were found 2 days after her abduction. This is not true. Her purse or the contents of her purse were never found. Her family has verified this with detectives. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Spokane County Sheriff's Office 509-477-4760.
Number 7.
Jody was last seen in Kansas City, Missouri on May 23, 1985. She went to her boyfriend's residence located near East 7th Street and Cambridge Avenue. Some agencies give the address as the 700 block of Cambridge Avenue, where they allegedly got into argument. She wanted to accompany him and other friends somewhere, but they refused to let her do so. She left his residence and walked around the corner to her friend, Melissa Forscroft's, house located on East 14th Street and Winchester Avenue. At approximately 10 p.m., Jody called her mother, Karen Stratton, and asked for a ride home to the 6800 block of East Topping Street. Karen told Jody, however, that she did not have her car as it was unavailable to her at the time. She was unable to get her and bring her home, but Jody said that's okay, Mom and I have some friends who can bring me home. She then left Melissa's residence and she assumed that Jody was walking back to her boyfriend's home. Jody was last seen walking northbound on Winchester from 14th Street. She disappeared and was never seen or heard from again afterwards. It was initially suspected that she had left on her own accord. At the time of her disappearance, Jody was enrolled in a juvenile probation program. She had gotten herself into trouble in 1984 after she and a friend pushed a security guard. Jody also had issues with school truancy. She would regularly see a deputy juvenile officer as a result. When Jody failed to return home from her friend's residence, Karen notified the officer who told her that her daughter was probably angry about something and that she should give her the weekend to cool off. Stratton now regents that decision because when the weekend passed, Jody still wasn't home and she hadn't contacted anyone she knew or family members. Jody's DJO filed 2 warrants which listed her as an endangered juvenile and they ordered for her arrest if she was spotted anywhere. Stratton also assumed that the juvenile officer had filed a missing persons report on her daughter at the time. Karen would spend the next 2 years putting up flyers with Jody's description and talk to people that her daughter was known to hang out with in 1985. Karen didn't get any answers regarding her daughter's disappearance, but she continued to hope she would someday return. In July of 1986, the warrant for Jody's arrest was cancelled, and the officer advised Karen to report her daughter as missing to the police. She was shocked as she believed that a missing persons report was made when she told the juvenile court that her daughter had gone missing. Authorities began investigating the case soon afterwards, but had little to go on by the time a formal report was sent in regarding her disappearance. They did interview Jody's friends from 1985, but they didn't offer any information regarding her whereabouts. While investigators initially suspected she was a runaway, her case was said to be unusual by authorities at the time. Jody and her family moved 4 times before she turned 14 years old. She also previously ran away from home 3 times prior to her disappearance, but she returned those other times. Her parents also divorced in 1981, but they reconciled after Stratton's second marriage ended in divorce. She has a good relationship with her mother in 1985. Jody didn't take any extra clothing or money with her on the night she disappeared. Her friends also stated that she intended to meet her mother that night. Authorities noted that over 1,300 runaways were reported to Kansas City police in 1986, but they were all accounted for. Jody was not found, and her case didn't fit the usual pattern of a runaway in the area. Most runaways were found within a few days, or within a short period of time, which was not the occurrence in her disappearance. In the years that would follow Jody's disappearance, Karen would get various phone calls regarding the case and supposedly what happened to her daughter. Stratton stated she would get calls frequently during the holidays and on Jody's birthday. The anonymous callers on the other end would either taint her about her daughter's disappearance or give her possible tips on her whereabouts. Stratton said some days she would get 3 or 4 phone calls at her home in Odessa, Missouri, where she moved to after her daughter's disappearance. Some of the callers would tell her that Jody was living on the streets and how she was involved in prostitution and the usage of drugs. Other callers would threaten her daughter's life. Starting in 1993, Stratton would receive threatening phone calls to her home which lasted for 2 years. The callers would often demand money or ransom in exchange for Jody's return. In one of the phone calls, the caller said, "If we don't get the money, your daughter will be sent to you in pieces." Stratton would record these phone calls and sent them to the police. The phone calls were eventually traced back to a payphone in Kansas City. No one has been identified as the caller, and they haven't been proven to be involved in Jody's disappearance. In April of 1997, authorities announced that the 12-year-old search for Jody as a missing person was coming to an end and that they were classifying the case as a probable homicide. Authorities stated they believed that Jody likely died around the same time she disappeared and was probably killed at the hands of a murderer. They also announced they had a suspect in her disappearance, but declined to publicly identify them. 2 prison inmates from 2 different prisons came forward and told authorities that they knew Jody was murdered and that her body might have been stashed into a vehicle which was then driven into the Missouri River near Riverfront Park. Authorities announced that they would be dragging the river in an effort to potentially locate Jody's body and solve her disappearance. They stated they were going to search with sonar equipment in 2 areas with launches in Riverfront Park and would potentially move east to a bridge near Missouri 291. Experts from the Missouri State Water Patrol, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would help with the search operation. However, the search turned up no traces of Jody or any vehicle. Investigators now call the tip bogus and have stated they don't believe the 2 inmates were very truthful when they relayed the supposed information they had on Jody's murder. Most investigators believe, however, that Jody is indeed dead and was probably murdered. Karen continues to hold out hope that Jody is alive and might be in hiding or doesn't want to be found. She has been actively searching for her since 1985. Karen believes it's possible Jody did indeed leave on her own when she went missing in 1985 and says she doesn't blame her for doing so if that's what occurred. Stratton said their home environment was dysfunctional and she, along with Jody's father, Marlene Ledkins, did not get along well. Jody was also having problems at school when she went missing in addition to her home life. Karen later found out that Jody's deputy juvenile officer received a letter from someone claiming to be her daughter, approximately 4 years after her disappearance. The letter stated that Jody was alright and that maybe someday she would say why she decided to leave. Stratton has stated she isn't sure whether the letter is actually from her daughter or not, and comparison to Jody's handwriting from prior to her disappearance proved fruitless. Authorities have stated that it was Karen's perseverance to find her long-lost daughter that kept Jody's case open all these years. She got onto the talk show circuit and made sure to tap every single missing child computer network. She repeatedly contacted the police to inform them about leads, and she even ran down tips herself as well. She has since moved away from Missouri and lives in Arkansas, but she does visit Kansas City a few times every year to search for her daughter. While authorities believe it's possible Jody chose to deliberately leave, they believe something happened to Jody which jeopardized her safety. Her case is presently investigated as a missing persons case, but police suspect foul play was involved. Jody's case remains unsolved.